Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Science Week's Science Made Beerable event. Thank you for joining us for this live-streamed beer tasting science extravaganza. But before we start, we'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that this event is being held, the Mawanina people of Nipaluna. And we'd like to pay respects to the elders past, present and emerging.
And we also have some thanks to give. So before we get started, we need to thank the National Science Week Tasmanian Coordinating Committee and Inspiring Tasmania for the funding and support for the event. We also thank Hobart Brewing Co for hosting us, JRS Videography for doing all the videography of the live stream that's happening at the moment, and thanks to Hop, Vine and Still for all the distribution of the beer. So with no further ado, we might as well get into the first beer. So our first beer of the night is a Happy Place by OCHO. So we have our brewers here. I better introduce the brewers actually. So we have Will from Dieman Brewing. Then next to him we have Stu from OCHO. Then we have Alex from here at Hobart Brewing Co. and Cornell from Shambles. So thanks everyone for joining us.
Love you, Cornell. Love you, Cornell.
So Stu, would you mind introducing yourself, tell us a bit about your brewery and the beer and why you chose this beer in particular to highlight the science of brewing?
Cheers, thank you, Kelsey. I'm Stu from OCHO. We're based up in the north, Launceston sort of area. Now brewing out of Beaconsfield, Miners Gold Brewery. Formerly brewing out of this guy's brewery. He was generous enough to let me get a foot in the door. So tonight I've brought Happy Place, which is, we call it a hoppy farmhouse ale. It's a bit of a tricky one to try and pin down into a sort of category. But I guess the most interesting thing about it is the yeast style that we chose for it. So it actually, I've just realised the label's actually got the wrong name for the yeast that we've used in this batch. Similar concept.
Don't look at the label.
No, ignore that. But the idea is, so with regular brewer's yeast, you'll be with an ale, you'll be fermenting around 20 degrees, something like that. And with these isolated, very particular strains of yeast that we most often use, if you deviate too far away from that temperature, you'll get a wildly different beer. So if you try and ferment with an ale strain at 15 degrees instead of 20, the fermentation will take a long time and you'll get potentially some weird flavours created. And by the same token, if you ferment a regular ale strain at say 25 degrees instead of 20, it probably won't be drinkable. You'll get heaps of the yeast go into a frenzy basically and create a lot of higher alcohols and crazy fruity esters and stuff which don't belong in most beers. With the yeast strain we chose for this beer comes out of Norway of all places. There's sort of a farmhouse brewing tradition in far western Norway, and one guy in particular, a researcher in Norway, has basically gone around and done ethnographic studies of the brewing traditions in these different villages, and different families were passing down yeast through generations and that sort of thing. And these yeasts, they're known in the local dialect as kveik. And this is one of them. This is fermented with a strain called Voss. And one of the unusual things about those strains is, firstly, you can ferment at 40 degrees, which is what we did with this beer. As I said, if you did that with a regular yeast, the beer would absolutely not be drinkable. You'd get burnt rubber, you'd get solvent, nail polish, just horrible sort of flavours. But for whatever reason, these yeasts have sort of adapted over time to being brewed in a very particular way in these little farms in rural Norway. And as it happens, they've isolated some of these strains. Home brewers have started using them, and then commercial brewers like me have sort of caught on and wanted to experiment with them. So we chose it for this beer because it creates lots of nice spicy characters, which we've paired with the rye malt. Also gives you some sort of spicy character, and some nice orange zest type character. And for a pretty low alcohol beer, 3.5%, it gives quite a lot of body as well. So we've essentially ripped this Norwegian farmhouse strain, put it into a beer which is nothing like what they would have brewed back in the day. But the characteristics of that yeast sort of work with this style of beer for whatever reason. It was a bit of an experiment back in the day when we first brewed it, but that was a couple of years ago, and it seems to sell pretty well. People like it, so.
Great, thanks, Stu. I have a question about it being a mid-strength, because it is 3.5. Is it the yeast that is the reason that it has that body? Is that what's responsible? Because I wouldn't be able to tell it's a mid-strength.
Yeah, I think partly a big part of it is that the yeast potentially creates other components which add to the mouthfeel, and I don't know what those are necessarily. But the other thing that we've done is we've added sea salt to this beer, about 0.2 grams per litre of sea salt. So it's not a huge addition. That's something that we pulled from other beer styles, such as there's a German sour beer style called gose, which traditionally has an addition of sea salt. Actually, it was traditionally brewed with naturally salty water, naturally saline water. And I've found through experimentation that adding sea salt, there's something about the chloride in particular that adds to mouthfeel. Emphasising that chloride in the brewing water is something that is used in particularly brewing hazy IPAs, where you're after that full, quite soft mouthfeel.
Yeah, that's actually, we had a question through the week from Ben Dagg, which was asking about the water chemistry of hazy IPAs, because this beer is obviously quite hazy.
Yep.
So can you tell us more about the water chemistry and how that works?
Yeah. I'll be the first to admit as a brewer that it's still a bit of a mystery. There's a lot of things going on with hazy IPAs. I think water chemistry is definitely one factor. I'm not 100% convinced that it's the only factor. I'd love to do an experiment and try and make a hazy beer with distilled water or water that you would normally see in a West Coast IPA, for example. But the general consensus is that the two main anions in water that brewers look at are sulfate and chloride, and generally the higher the sulfate level, the more crisp the bitterness is, and the higher the chloride, the more sort of, I guess, you emphasise the malt a little bit more than the hops, and at higher levels you tend to get a bit more of that softer mouthfeel as well.
Nice. So you spoke about how, I'm going to say this wrong, the yeast name. Should I even try it?
I don't. Yeah.
Maybe we should all try it. Who can say it and who can't? Kavik?
Yeah.
Did I butcher that?
I don't know. I've heard a lot of people say it a lot of different ways, but I've the most reliable source I found is that you basically say it to rhyme with quake, as in earthquake, quake. So the V is more of a W, and the I and the E sort of roll in, so quake.
All right. Well, now that I've done that, let's go back to the temperature. You said it had a high thermotolerance, and you said it's adapted to have that high thermotolerance. Why would it need to adapt to have that? Is that just that the beers aren't cooling down as fast in these Norwegian villages? Well,
so the guy who did the research all over rural Norway and uncovered these strains, and he spoke to the brewers, and they were often, older guys who'd been brewing for their family for 50 years, and they'd been taught by their dad and that sort of thing. Very rustic techniques. Often they were raw beers, so they'd not been... It's customary, well, these days modern brewers will boil the wort, which is the unfermented beer, before cooling it down again and then pitching the yeast. These guys were often conducting the mash, which is where you mix the malted barley and the water in wooden vessels, stirring it around for a while. The water would often have been infused with juniper. They only probably recently started using hops. They would, to heat it up, they would infuse more boiling water into it. Obviously, being a wooden vessel, you can't heat it up over a fire. And I think the temperature thing was probably more of a, let's try and guess the temperature. You dip your finger in it. Body temperature, blood temperature that's when it's ready to have yeast pitched into it. So
I've heard it described as milk warm.
Yeah.
Which means milk fresh from the udder, I think.
Yeah. So I reckon it would be something like that. There'd be, rather than having strict temperature control, they'd be pitching warm. As you can imagine, in rural Norway, it's pretty cold. So they would be trying to get the yeast to do the work to ferment the beer as quickly as possible before that vessel cooled down. A lot of this I'm just... it's conjecture.
I suppose that if these families are using the yeast for generations and generations, there's going to be a selective pressure put on those yeasts. So if they're using the same method every time and putting boiling water in the mix, only the yeast that's able to reproduce and keep going will be the ones that are able to withstand that. So you end up with a population that are more thermotolerant.
That's right, and I think that the researcher found that the methods used by each of the guys doing the brewing they were quite distinct, but they were quite rigorous in their brewing technique, so they would stick to the same method each time. That's another unique thing about these yeasts, is that and this is probably partly because of the temperature, they work faster at high temperatures, as all yeast do, but the fermentation length, rather than these days, for us being 4 to 7 days, say, these would be done in 24 to 72 hours. And this beer was 2.5 days in the fermenter before it was done.
Wow. Just for those who don't know, how long does it normally take?
Anywhere up to 10 days, I guess.
So much, much faster.
Yep.
We had a question from Sam Eastoe. I think he's in the audience, so I'm sorry if I said your name wrong. So he asked, I've heard that each batch of Happy Place uses a different generation of Kvik yeast. Maybe I should just not try and say it. From the previous batch of beer. So have you seen any changes in the newer version compared to the older versions?
We've used... I'm pretty sure this is batch number 8 that we've done of this beer. We've used 3 different strains. This is using Voss, which is the one that we've used most most often. I think batch 2 used one called Hornindal, and we've also used, the one that's listed on the label is Simonatus, which is actually from Lithuania, not Norway, and it's slightly different, but it achieves the same sort of effect. I think, yeah, there's definitely differences between the strains, but I guess I've selected those based on others' experiences and descriptions of their experiences, essentially targeting tropical fruit character coming from the yeast. So that's sort of what I'm looking for.
Yeah, okay. By the way, we should say that if anyone has any questions throughout the night, send them through on Facebook if you're watching live, or if you're here with us in the audience, just raise your hand and we can toward them to the brewers. Right.
Well, so you were talking about the methods that the Norwegian families use, and I think Matt had a question for you about your method, whether you stick to the tradition.
Yeah, I didn't ask this one, probably on purpose. So I've heard that some Norwegian families scream into the fermenter when they're pitching it.
Yeah.
So you obviously do this with Happy Place, I'm guessing?
I don't, but maybe now I regret that I've never done that. It has a name, I forget what it is now, but it's a particular, it was a traditional, it was a sort of a custom, and it was, I think, to scare away the bad yeast. Yeah, but there's videos online of people doing it, and it's pretty cool.
Probably pitching their own saliva.
Yeah, so we have a question up the front. So I'll just repeat your question when you. So was. Okay, so the question is, what is a strain of yeast, and what does it take to go from one strain to another strain?
So a strain is essentially sort of an isolated, like a family of yeast that behaves in a certain sort of defined way. So generally, if the labs that produce the yeast that I'm using would be reproducing that particular isolated family of yeast, so that every time I buy a packet with Voss written on it, I know what results I'm getting. And I mean, there can be genetic drift with strains, so that if you keep reusing, and some breweries do this, if you keep reusing the one strain of yeast in a particular way, as we were talking about before, you can put selective pressures on the yeast and effectively you can select for particular characteristics. So if you always fermented at 20 degrees instead of 40, you could potentially favour a particular part of that family of yeasts that would then, after multiple generations, begin behaving in a different way, I guess.
So the families are they're always using the same yeast over and over until it sometimes goes bad, and then they borrow it from a neighbour.
Yep.
I've seen, like, when they're pitching it, because I watched that video of a family screaming into and it looks like they've dried it out, and it looks kind of like fingernails. Like, how is that? I homebrew, and I've only seen it in liquid form, or the little, bread kind of yeast. How is that? What is happening there? Why does it look like fingernails?
That's another unique thing about these yeast strains, the Quake strains, is that most yeast strains can't be dried out, or not very easily. They essentially, if you dry them out, they die, and so they can't be brought back. But for whatever reason, these yeasts are able to be dried and then rehydrated, and they'll behave normally. So when yeast have finished doing the job of fermenting the sugars and whatnot, they flocculate, so they cling together and then they drop to the bottom of the fermenter. And we call that the slurry at the end, at the bottom of the fermenter. And you can, in Norway, they would collect a little bit of that slurry, actually either from the bottom of the fermenter, or with some strains they would actually scoop it off the top, if it's one of those strains that rises to the top during fermentation. And they'd spread it like a paste on paper or cloth or something, and it would dry out. And that was how they would then repitch that yeast into the next batch. Like I said, you can't do that with most strains of yeast, but for whatever reason, these Quake strains can do that.
Well, how are we going for time? This is going to move quite quickly, isn't it?
Question at the front again.
Yep.
So the question is, how does chlorine affect the brewing process? Chlorine is a disinfectant in water to get rid of microbes. So is that a problem in the brewing process?
It can be. So we all filter our water. Just through a simple carbon filter, we'll take out all the chlorine. And also, the first thing we do at the beginning of a brew day is actually heat up the water, and that's going to get rid of most of the chlorine that's in there anyway.
You was talking about chloride.
Oh, sorry. Oh, chloride. Right. Yeah. So chloride being the salt, as opposed to free chlorine, which is more of a disinfectant. Yep.
Had a question from Facebook from Kerry Hennessy. He said, how do you reharvest the yeast if barrel brewing?
It's open to anyone.
Will, you do barrels?
You love barrels. We probably... The simple answer to that is we inoculate barrels with a known yeast, and then whatever microflora or microclimate exists in a barrel such as this, it'll enact in its own unique manner, and then pretty much every barrel that we utilise has its own personality and way that it'll actually ferment. So the ability to recreate that barrel is the same as that barrel is very difficult. So we probably don't repitch from barrel to barrel, largely because it's you pretty much can't. They're all individual vessels.
So the yeast is there already, basically?
We can certainly put when the beer goes into a barrel, we certainly have a known yeast in that, or known yeasts and bacteria, but then how they behave within the microclimate of the barrel is completely dependent upon how they're stored, the variety of beer in there, the style, the age, the time that it's in the barrel. So it's the black magic of brewing.
I think part of the question might have been about harvesting yeast from a barrel, but you wouldn't reuse barrels.
No,
basically.
we wouldn't.
Once it's done, it's done.
We certainly wouldn't reharvest yeast from the barrel.
And certain yeasts will still live in the wood itself as well, unless you're going through a pretty rigorous sterilisation process of the barrels.
Yeah, depending on what the brewer chooses to do, certain brewers will decide to, once they empty a barrel, they will go to steam clean it, try and get out every last bit of yeast that's in there, and then re-inoculate it again, or potentially sulphur it so that it holds in situ for a period of time until they backfill it. When we try to do it, we try and do it the moment that we've emptied it, We're pretty much cleaning it, we're giving it a hot rinse, and then we're backfilling it within 24 to 48 hours. So we're not really giving it an opportunity, or what we want to try and do is maximise the microclimate that's in the barrel and utilise that to the best of its capabilities.
We have another question coming in from Facebook. This is a pretty general question, so it's directed to all the brewers. It's from Jeremy Just, and it says, is it easier or harder to get into craft brewing now? Is it more popular than ever? Lots of choice. So is it because there's so much choice, is it difficult to get into?
Was that about craft brewing or about getting into drinking craft beer?
Well, it says get into craft brewing now. It is more popular than ever. So maybe it's saying because there's so much choice, if you wanted to start a brewery, maybe it's difficult because there's so much competition.
I would agree with that. I reckon we started 12 years ago, and it was, I think we were, off the top of my head, I think we're the 40th or 50th brewery in Australia, whereas now there's upwards of 650. So I think certainly the market has matured to a point where there's recognition of the styles that are being produced and stuff. So I think from that competitive side of things, it is certainly harder to open a brewery nowadays than what it was when we opened. But at the same time, and you guys out there now and out on the stream are examples of it. The palates have matured, and so you understand styles and you recognise flavours and things that potentially you wouldn't have done 5-10 years ago. So it's sort of it's a catch-22 situation.
I reckon it's easier to start, harder to succeed. So there are more opportunities. Yeah, poignant, right? There are more opportunities, like Will was saying, there are more breweries around, which also means there are a lot of breweries with spare capacity. So there are a lot of breweries happily giving up tanks to, contract or gypsy brewers to try out, bringing their beer to market.
Yeah.
And I don't know many breweries that aren't doing that on some level. So I reckon there are a lot of people getting more of an easy leg up to kind of test the waters, but turning that into a commercial reality and starting your own brewery, let alone making it successful, I reckon that's harder because of the competition.
Yeah. I have a basic question for all of you. I suppose, did you all start home brewing? Did you get into the industry just from small beginnings, all of you?
I did.
Yeah? Everyone's nodding?
No, I didn't.
You didn't?
No.
Yeah, you did. You just started at like 1,000 litre scale.
Yeah, no, I jumped.
It was your home.
I jumped in the deep end.
Farm.
Yeah. No, I didn't. No, I was never a home brewer. Yeah.
But you do live at your brewery now?
I do.
and
I don't know. I don't know where the angle is here.
All right, so I think we'll move on to the next beer. Thanks, Stu. That was super interesting. Nice to highlight the science of yeasts, which are obviously extremely important in beer. So the next beer we have, you will have all been handed out some beers. This is Shambles Dances with Hops. So you also notice you've got some glasses in front of you. You should have one glass per beer, so you can have a fresh glass with each beer. We'll have an intermission after this one, and then you'll get fresh glasses, so you shouldn't have to rinse them out or anything. So Cornell, if you can introduce yourself, Shambles as a brewery, and why you chose Dances with Hops for tonight.
Hi, I'm Cornell, and I'm an alcoholic. So easy joke, had to lead with it. Wrong meeting. I'm from Shambles. We have a brewery just up the road on Elizabeth Street. Like everyone here except Will, who won't admit it, I was sort of home brewer to turned pro kind of thing. I do have a science background, so the science of beer always really interested me. It was sort of the thing that I guess turned it into a passion rather than just a hobby. I picked this beer because we were sort of asked to sort of pick a topic around the science of beer that was either close to our heart or kind of fit in with the panel. And Stu's talking about yeast. I'll talk a little bit about hops. Alex will talk about malt, and I guess that leaves water for you, Will. Get your water chemistry notes. I think you're going to talk about farmhouse styles and the whole kind of agricultural side of what brings these amazing ingredients to us to use. There's heaps and heaps of science in beer. We just talked a little bit about yeast, and that's only scratching the surface. And same goes with every other ingredient. It's a real kind of chemical cocktail in here. And there's a lot going on, a lot of different ingredients. It's only a handful of categories if you don't start including adjuncts and fruit and all the other things that we can put in beer. Orange juice and other weird things, lactose. But within each of those categories, there's so much science and so many options about what we use and how we use it, and it differs from style to style and from brewer to brewer. That it kind of allows us to kind of play a lot and just with Stu's sort of stories about investigating weird and wonderful yeasts from far-flung parts of the world and how you'll apply those. It's great. So this beer, it's a fairly traditional American style IPA. American style because the traditional English styles are sort of maltier and more bitter, whereas modern American IPAs tend to sort of focus more on hop flavour and aroma. The bitterness is still there, but the flavour and aroma form a massive part of the style. And I guess the interesting thing is that a lot of hop science has been known for I'd say hundreds of years, but formally last sort of 100 years, a lot of research has been done by many brewers and researchers connected to universities who are connected to breweries, and we've learnt a lot about hops and what's in them and how they impact on beer. But we're still learning. So some of the things that are now trends are sort of reflecting a lack of knowledge. People sort of experimenting and doing new things with an old ingredient and suddenly creating styles that don't make sense, that everyone's kind of latching onto, and they're loving them, and they're not, and no one quite knows what's going on. So sort of perfect example with this beer is that traditionally hops are used mostly, to bitter a beer. So the bitter flavour in hops, the bitterness comes from hops. Sorry, in beer comes from hops. And it's been known for a long time that the major contributor, the chemical compound in hops that contributes that are a group of 3 chemicals that are collectively known as alpha acids. Something that exists naturally in hop flowers, and when boiled, those alpha acids isomerise. That means the chemical changes shape, and they go magically from being insoluble. They're in the sticky kind of goop that's inside hop flowers. You can take some hop flowers or some hop pellets and crush them up and stick them in a glass of water and stir it around. And if you drink it, it won't taste very nice, but you'll certainly get a bit of bitterness and some some weird flavoured thing. That's probably the new trend. But if you just let it settle, most of that material will settle to the bottom of the glass, and if you drink the water off the top, it won't actually taste that bitter, because naturally the alpha acids in hops don't dissolve. But if you heat them up, and particularly higher temperatures, so boiling temperatures, do it for a long time, the chemical changes shape and suddenly it becomes soluble, so it dissolves, and that means it stays in the beer. So even if the hop material settles to the bottom, the liquid, the beer, is bitter. And that was sort of the primary function of hops for a very, very long time. It was known that they also contributed flavours and aroma, but because they were being added earlier on in the boil, most of those chemical compounds that contribute flavour and aroma were tending to be boiled off. So they were being added, the longer you boil them, the more bitterness you kind of impart to the beer. But obviously the longer you boil, the more those easily driven off aromatic sort of chemicals that give you flavours and aromas, they get driven off, so they don't stay in the beer. So it became a trend in brewers to try and do both of those things. You'd add some hops at the start, boil them for a long time for bitterness. You'd add some right at the end, when they're not boil them for very long, or even after you'd turn the kettle off and it was just sort of steeping hot. You'd put hops in to hopefully dissolve some of those flavours and aromas and leave them hanging around the beer. And traditionally it was thought that that unless your beer was boiling, you got no isomerisation, so the chemical didn't change and you didn't get any lasting kind of bitterness. So any hops you add at the end are just for aroma. they're not going to make your beer any more bitter. You have to boil them to make that happen. And it kind of became accepted wisdom, I think, for a long time, that's kind of how people brewed beers. You add the right amount of a particular hop to get a certain kind of bitterness, and then towards the end you would pick and choose your aroma hops based on, their characteristics of floral or fruity or whatever, and add those towards the end. But American brewers, American hop growers, for a start, their climate lent itself to completely different breeds of hops emerging, and the American-style hops tended to have very high levels of alpha acids, so quite bitter, twice as much of this chemical in them as what traditional European hops had. And most people were sort of focused on that. They're more bitter. But what tended to go along with that was also that they had more of these aromatic oils, so more flavour, more aroma. And American brewers started to sort of embrace that, and, to the horror of some traditional European brewers, were adding stupid amounts of hops to their beers. And when they started to recreate more traditional English styles like the English IPA, which is a highly hopped beer, tended to be more focused on the bittering and malty and bitter, they were creating sort of lighter pale ales and just whacking heaps of hops in them and sort of focusing on this flavour and aroma part of the hop flower. Therefore putting more in later and less in earlier, or sometimes both. And a technique that was sort of called whirlpool hopping or hop steeping became more and more common. So brewers that basically were adding lots of hops after the kettle was turned off without the beer boiling. And this has been known for a long time. This isn't sort of new, but some of this older knowledge tends to take sort of a while to filter out to smaller brewers. The larger brewers sort of have, research partnerships with universities to investigate this stuff because it's interesting, but they're not about to, add 5 grams a litre of Amarillo to Budweiser. It's just not going to happen. Just because they've discovered something interesting about hop chemistry. But this stuff sort of tends to filter out to the smaller brewers and to home brewers, and so home brewers have gotten more skilled, more knowledge. There's more information available. And when I was homebrewing, IPAs were sort of becoming, they were already a massive style in the US amongst the emerging craft brewers, and they were starting to become a thing in Australia, and I was sort of fascinated with them. And, for most people to begin with, they were too bitter. It's just not standard beer. You can't drink this after having a sort of standard off-the-shelf, mainstream mass-produced beer, and it's not. My dad would hate this. He does. This is, what is this stuff? 'Cause it's not beer, because it's a completely different beast. So with this one, this is sort of an experiment in home brewing originally. This recipe, this was sort of like what happens if I add no bittering hops at all. So just nothing in the boil. So do the whole boil with nothing at the start, nothing in the middle, nothing at the end, and just add all my hops in the whirlpool. So no boiling, it's just hot, and not even hot for that long. Keep it hot and swirling for sort of 20 minutes. Possibly even add a bit of cold water to knock down the temperature on purpose, bring it from boiling down to sort of 90 degrees. Then steep the hops, and that gives you the opportunity to add like 5 times as much as you normally would, and not have a beer that's overly bitter. Right? So instead of, you might, on a sort of homebrew scale, be able to add like a whole kilo instead of, a few hundred grams, and not have a beer that's so bitter you can't drink it. And the interesting thing is that even at those lower temperatures, you still get isomerization, and because you've added more hops, it doesn't matter that the percentage of isomerization is low. It doesn't matter that you're not getting a whole heap of conversion and that staying bitterness, because you're adding 5 times as much hop, so you still get the bitterness in there. So this with this beer, I've sort of asked professional brewers and friends, what do you reckon the bittering level of this beer is? And there's sort of a measurable, debated a lot, but it's a measurable way of quantifying how bitter a beer is. They're called international beer bitterness units. So you can put a number on it, and in a very simple sense, that's meant to, in a laboratory, measure the amount of isomerized alpha acids that are present in your beer, right? And stick a number on it. A standard sort of everyday lager, even one that calls itself an ale, would probably be somewhere in the, 10 IBU range, maybe. Maybe 10 to 20. Like a Pilsner might be somewhere around 8. And your sort of standard, hoppy American pale ale / IPA would be somewhere around, sort of 40s to 50s. And a really, really hoppy beer, you're getting up into 70s and 80s, and a crazy, triple IPA would be, hovering up around 100. You kind of don't really get much happening above 100 as a number. And that's a measurable thing in a laboratory. Literally how much alpha acid has isomerized and stayed in this beer. And most people have told me that they would, just sensory, not measuring it in a lab, that this would be somewhere around the 50s with no hops added in the boil. So it's sort of throwing out a traditional method and doing something that's sort of a modern trend to still get bitterness, but also leave behind a whole heap of flavour and aroma. So the other thing brewers do to get more flavour and aroma in their beer from their hops is to not do it when it's hot at all. So wait for the beer to start fermenting or finish fermenting, and then add hops into the fermenter when the beer's cold. That's called dry hopping. I don't know why, because beer's still wet. But basically adding hops to the fermenter afterwards, and so those essential oils, which are really volatile, they boil off easily. You're adding it cold, and so that's sort of seeping out into the beer, and you're retaining some of those aromas and flavours, and you get completely different things out of your dry hops, even by using the same variety, putting it in the finished beer cold, than you do putting it in the hot beer when it's either still boiling or finished boiling. Then there's the whole interplay between hops and yeast. So a whole heap happens if you allow yeast to interact with and metabolise the things that your hops are putting into your beer. It's called biotransformation. And there's a whole heap of research being done in all these areas, and there's conjecture at the moment because no one really understands it all. And we're getting a better understanding of it, but there's still a long way to go to sort of have a complete picture of it all. So that's sort of just scratching the surface of what we know and where we're sort of heading. What?
It's a deep scratch.
No, that's super fascinating. I'm a big fan.
How long does this go for? Do you want to? We've got till midnight, don't we?
I'm a big fan of hops just from a plant science perspective. So if you didn't know, hops are a flower bud. The female flower bud is used in brewing of a bine, so B-I-N-E. It's kind of like a vine, but it doesn't have tendrils. I think they're really interesting because their flowers, the male and female flowers, are on separate plants. So that's not very common in botany. But this beer has 5 different types of hops. So that's 5 different cultivars. Mm-hmm. So I have a couple of questions on that note. So why do you add 5 different kinds? Do those different cultivars add different flavours? And then also I have a question about dry hopping and wet hopping. So often I see on cans something's dry hopped or wet hopped, and I don't actually know what that means. So if you could explain what that means.
So the 5 different varieties, there are, I don't know what, at least 100, probably 200 different varieties of hops commercially available. Maybe not quite 200 yet, but maybe if you go around the globe to all the different hop farms and some of the lesser known ones that we can't get here, I reckon there'd be 200 commercially grown varieties of hop. And just like the question before about yeast, they're all crosses of different varieties that all are selectively bred for different characteristics. Traditionally, they were mostly being bred for higher alpha acid percentage, because the higher the percentage of those bittering compounds, the less hops a brewer had to buy to put in their beer, and that was something that all the hop growers wanted. So it was a commodity. It was traded as a commodity. And also then selectively bred for resistance to certain pests and diseases. These days, that's completely flipped. So Hop Products Australia out in Bushy Park, they've got an extensive hop breeding program, and they now breed for aroma and a flavour and those essential oils, because that's what people want these days. Craft beer is booming on the back of these beers taste different, they taste good, and you've got nuance and variety. And every different variety of hop has a different makeup in terms of the different chemicals, and there are hundreds, if not thousands, of different chemicals in tiny amounts that some of them that contribute aroma and flavour, and they all work together. And some of them have, if you isolate them, they taste a certain way, but if you combine them in groups of 3 or 4, taste completely different again. So it's a really complex chemical kind of cocktail going on. So yeah, picking a hop, you can kind of read the description of what this hop's going to taste like and what it's going to do to your beer. And some of them will do different things depending on where you use them and how, whether you use them in the boil or in the in the whirlpool or in a dry hop. And we like to play, we like to experiment as brewers. So it's when you're home brewing, it's easy, because you make 20 or 25 or 50 litres of something and it tastes like crap, or you can throw it out or usually just drink it yourself. But it's no big deal. Whereas, on a commercial scale, that's a lot of beer to be throwing out. So, so you sort of tend to test things and play with small batches and try different hop combos together until you get something that you really, really like. And this was basically just a bit of I want to brew a beer that's ridiculously hoppy and, very, very American style, traditional. Now it's called West Coast, but we don't put that anywhere on the label because that's kind of a bit meaningless to me. It's an American style IPA, makes sense. West Coast versus East Coast, anyway. So this was sort of like, I want a whole range of flavours. I know which kinds I want. These are some of my favourite hops. I'm going to put them all together in this combination until I get a flavour profile I like. Next question was on wet hopping and dry hop. Dry hopping simply refers to adding hops in any form to your fermenter. So that can be hop flowers, or hop pellets, or these days hop extracts. I don't know if that still counts as dry hopping. I think we might as well call it that. But it's adding hops, and they're all processed in some way. So hop flowers, when we buy them, are not just straight off the vine. They are dried. They have been picked and they've been dried. Hop pellets are picked and dried and then crushed and pelletized. And that's because, like any flower, hops don't last very long once they're picked. So we've all sort of had flowers sitting in a vase on your table. They don't go so good after a couple of weeks. Hops are even sort of worse if they're picked fresh. You'll be lucky to get a couple of days before they start to go brown and slimy and green. So when they're picked, they are dried that day. So they have huge picking plants and kilns that basically they pile up the hops and turn them and blow warm air over them to dry them out. So all the hops we use are dried to preserve them. But if you are lucky enough to grow your own hops, like Will does, or if you're lucky enough to live near a hop farm, like we are, when they pick, and there's a short window for each variety, they get picked in a certain time of the year, and each variety gets picked in a different week, one after the other, depending on when they're ready. And if you're lucky enough to live nearby, they will offer us brewers the ability to take fresh hops that have literally just been picked and use them in our beer. So undried, straight off the vine. And they're completely different because the drying process obviously drives off some of the most volatile aromas and flavours. And they are, some people call them fresh hops, some people call them wet hops. So usually if you see on a label that something is a wet hop beer, it usually means it's picked green, straight off the vine, and then used in the beer straight away like that, as opposed to using a dried, preserved, bagged up thing that keeps for, a year or two.
I think... Can I just jump in? So the next beer you'll have will be our wet hop beer. So if you can enjoy this one now and have a memory of it, and then the next one you have will be ours, which is a wet hop beer, and for yourselves decide what the difference is between the hop characteristics.
Yeah, and that was a really it didn't happen this year for obvious reasons. But yeah, once a year in the picking window for our local farm, for our local hop grower, it was a really great opportunity for all of us to kind of play around with something that we can only use once a year, and it's different every year too because it's an agricultural product, so it changes from year to year. And you can use it in different styles and different ways. It was really great. And there was a whole sort of beer festival in Launceston created around it called the Fresh Hop Festival that I think we all miss dearly at the moment because it was a lot of fun and it gave us all an excuse to play with this amazing ingredient in a different way.
We just have a question that came in from Peter, Derbyshire. It says, is it a secret recipe or can you tell me which hops are in it?
No, I don't think it does. I was about to say it says it on the label, but it doesn't. Just couldn't fit all the text. No, it's a secret. Or I can't remember. No, no, I'm kidding. So the secret is that I think at the moment there are actually 6 hops in it, but we weren't about to reprint 50,000 cans just to add 6 instead of 5. We decided to add a tiny little bit of Chinook just before the end of the boil, just before we turn the kettle out for this little sort of spicy kick of bitterness. But the main sort of 5 hops in it are Cascade, locally grown, Amarillo, Centennial, Mosaic and Simcoe.
Great. Well, I think it's probably a good moment to go to an interval. We're going to have a break so everybody gets a chance to go to the bathroom. We'll get fresh glasses. But thank you so much, Cornell. I know you have to nip off now. Thank you. All right, welcome back. So I'm hoping everyone has a bottle of farm juice in front of them. If they don't, please put your hand up and someone will bring you one. If you need it opened, also put your hand up. We have some bottle openers roaming around, but everyone seems like they're okay. That's great. Just also a reminder, you don't have to drink all of your beer tonight. You don't have to open them. You can take them with you. But we definitely recommend tasting them while we're talking about them. All right, so the next beer that we're going to talk about is Van Dieman's Farm Juice, made by Will. So, Will, if you could introduce yourself, your brewery, and why you chose this beer for tonight.
All right then. Welcome everybody. Thank you very much for coming tonight. I'm Will Tatchell, head brewer and founder at Van Dieman Brewing. So we're a farm brewery based out of Evandale in northern Tasmania. As I said earlier, we've been going for around 11 and a half years. My history in brewing is, yes, I was never a home brewer. I jumped straight in the deep end of an ag science degree down here in Hobart, and then went to England and worked in England as a brewer over there. And then came back to Australia and looked at where the market was, and we decided to start up Van Dieman in 2000. Or we put the wheels into motion in 2007, and our first brew went down in 2009, and then subsequently we've transitioned from. At the time, we were producing a broad style of. A broad array of styles of beer, pretty much because the market dictated that. We needed to offer something for everyone. But as you guys as drinkers have matured, and as the market has come to mature itself, we're now able to start to nail down what it is we actually want. So being based on a farm, we're able to grow the ingredients that are produced in beer. We utilise for the production of beer, and we're then subsequently able to brew with them. So we're in a that process probably started about 4 or 5 years ago, and we're now in the midst of that transition, going all the way through from where we started, and then hopefully in 4 or 5 years' time, just about every beer that is produced within the brewery is produced from ingredients on the farm. So it's relatively unique in the brewing side of things. So we have fantastic access to ingredients from suppliers within the brewing industry, whether it be yeast, hops, malt. The water that we have here in Tassie, I think all the brewers in Tassie will agree that we're in God's country with regards to brewing with that. So with regards to that, we're able to produce styles of beer that are a terrific quality and quantity and hold up on the world stage. For us, we took it a little bit further. So being on land and being of an agricultural background, I'd always grown up on farms. And I'd always seen beer as an agricultural product. So as much as Cornell, who's now left, sort of speaks about the scientific side of things, and yes, we are in the midst of Science Week, but beer in an essence is essentially an agricultural product. It's made of 4 key ingredients: water, hops, grains or malted grains, and yeast. So from a simplistic point of view, it's relatively easy to produce a beer. Now the difference is when you go to a commercial side of things is producing a beer that people want to buy, part with their money, and then subsequently recreate. So for us to be able to do that from a farm side of things, and from my agricultural side of things, it was always a case of, well, we can grow we've grown grain for a period of years. Why are we growing that grain as a commodity, and why are we shipping it off farm or sending it off farm, selling it to someone else to value add to it, and then we buy it back off them to then brew the beer? Where's the catch? Like, surely we should be closing the gap and sort of working out what we can do in between. And from the grain point of view, that's a malting side of things, which is where we essentially trick the grain into growing. We change the internal structure of the barley or the wheat or whichever cereal we're utilising at the time, to a point where the sugars are then accessible for us as brewers to utilise and turn into alcohol during the brewing stage. The hops, for hands up, if you've seen a hop plant growing in commercial fields, yeah, a large majority. They're an incredibly romantic, well, for me as a brewer, they're an incredibly romantic thing to see, particularly between the months of sort of September through to December, where they grow upwards of 10 to 12 inches a day up strings and stuff, and they get to 4, 5, 6 metres in height, start to blossom or start to flower and things, and to think that they create arguably what is at the moment the most synonymous ingredient with beer. It's incredibly romantic. So we put hop plants in at the brewery 10 years ago on a corner of the brewery, so that every time we drove past it, particularly during those months of September through to December, January, February, we would drive past it and see it. And that was largely for my benefit. It was never driven for the commercial side of things to actually grow it, to sustain us for any period of time, but it's subsequently built on that, and that's where we are. The water we get for the beer is largely rainwater, spring water, and then we do have access to town water as well. So we're drawing from on-farm springs, which we're taking through water filtration, which Stu spoke about. Our water's relatively poor for straight out of the ground and brewing with, so we have to take it through a treatment. It's essentially a reverse osmosis treatment, strips everything out of it, gives us what is pure water to brew with, and then we're able to then dial up a water profile on the beers. So if we're brewing a stout, we're bringing up a water profile that's largely equivalent to a sort of a Dublin water profile where Guinness is brewed. If we're brewing an IPA, we're bringing up a Burton-on-Trent in England, which is the home of the IPAs. And wherever it might be, some of our Belgian lambic or spontaneous beers, we're bringing up sort of a Belgian water profile and things. So it gives us that capability to play with what is arguably the biggest ingredient in beer. And then yeast. The yeast is probably the super critical and the underplayed component of beer. Stu spoke about it before, using a Norwegian yeast. In this, so this is our wet hop beer for this year. In this beer, there is this year's harvest of hops. There is this year's harvest of grain. There is this year's. There's essentially, when I say that this is a fresh beer, our Everton yeast, which is our house culture within the brewery, it's essentially like a sourdough culture when you're producing bread. So it's something that we can continually ticking over, utilising it. We've captured that from a spontaneous capture, or we've sat beer out. Everything around us at the moment, there are yeasts and bacteria floating around us all the way at the moment, especially in a brewery, and especially around Jimmy's beard. That are able to then subsequently brew things, and we've taken an isolation out of that spontaneous to isolate 2 Saccharomyces strains of yeast, which then turn into our Everton strain. And so the beer that you've got in front of you is our farm juice. It's a wet hop beer. So what are some of the... I'm going to ask a question to the crowd that's here. What are some of the flavours that you're getting from this compared to Cornell's Dancers with Hops? Sorry? Very strong. In what characteristic? The alcohol taste, yeah. Anyone else? Peat, yeah. So an organic, sort of earthy sort of character, yeah. Eucalyptus, yeah. So like a leafy sort of character. I know for me, I certainly get a green sort of a green character out of this, and that's largely driven from when we harvest the hops. So we pick the hops once a year. It gives us an opportunity. Cornell was saying that the difference between dry hops and wet hops. We get one opportunity a year to utilise these wet hops. We're probably not the greatest employers for our hops, because the day after we pick them, we attack them with a whippersnapper and completely destroy them. And that's when we add them into this beer. And we've subsequently learnt off this beer that we probably attacked them a little too hard. And so what you're actually tasting in this beer is the green component of the hops, or the green component of the leaves, which is chlorophyll. And it gives you this green tannic, earthy sort of character, which is actually for us, it's degraded the character of the hops. And it's something that we've actually learnt from. So we've done this the previous 2 years for harvest beers. We've attacked it with a whippersnapper, and the reason we do that is to basically destroy the hop flowers so that we expose the insides of the hop cone, so that we get more access to the yellow lupulin glands, so that we're trying to extract. We're trying to ascertain or trying to garner more of an extraction from the hop plants. This year we probably took it a bit too far. I don't know whether I had a couple of beers too many while we were brewing, or there's a couple of videos floating around online of me getting a little bit excited with the whippersnapper. As I said, it's a once-a-year opportunity for us to do, and we probably took it too far. And so this time in March next year when we go to brew this, we'll probably pull back on the whippersnapper to the point where we may even go a 50-50 split, so that we're not trying to get that green character out of the beer. As well as in the beer, this has got malt. So we have a sort of a prototype maltings plant at the brewery where we're growing malt growing barley and wheat on the farm, and then we're then brewing with it. But the missing link in between is the malting stage. So the malting stage is where we harvest the grain. We then have to store it for at minimum 8 to 10 weeks, so it goes through a dormancy period. We then pull it out of silo. The malting stage is we soak it in water. The grain swells, thinks that it's in the ground. We put it out on the floor of the brewery, and it essentially starts growing. After about 5 or 6 days, we're, again, not the greatest employers in the world, and we go and grab that grain, we go and throw it in a hot kiln at about 60 degrees for a period of time. We finally finish it off at about 75, 79 degrees, and that holds. What's essentially happened during that malting phase is we've converted all the proteins and enzymes in the grain into carbohydrates, and those carbohydrates are essentially sugars locked in the grain, which are then available for us as brewers to break down during the brewing stage. So we grew this grain it was sown May 20th. We harvested it January 4th. It was in silo until March the 4th, so around 8 to 9 weeks. We malted it. It was pulled out of the kiln hot on the morning that we brewed this, so it actually came into the brewery hot. And I haven't heard of another brewery doing that, pulling it out of kiln at the same time. So when we say it's a fresh hop beer, it's actually a fresh beer in the true essence of the word. So hopefully you enjoy it.
Yeah, so you're farming and growing everything on the farm. So your barley, your hops, you're growing. You also, once you're making the beer, you're also adding some yeast that you've cultivated from the air in the farm, so it's really a true home strain yeast.
The furthest an ingredient travelled for this beer is about 300 metres.
Nice.
Yeah.
And so once you've added the yeast, you're also kind of farming yeast as well, because you need to keep it happy, making the product that you want out of it to get the end product that you're happy with. How much of this process feels like a science, and how much feels more like art? Because it sort of feels like it combines the two.
I'm really conscious of this answer, given that we're in the midst of Science Week. In the grand scheme of things, it's probably I see it very much as a byplay of the two. So there is very much a scientific base to it, and understanding that the moment that we grow barley on the 20th of May, that barley is then destined to be making beer. So the soil bed that we have, the variety of grain that we choose to grow, the climate that it's grown in, and thank God that's why we're in Tassie, sort of all the way through, so that we're able to control the process from the growing stage through the processing stage, and then subsequently to the brewing stage. So we have full control, whether that be an application of herbicide or fertiliser or irrigation, or the varieties of hops that we actually have. And I mean, this is a great example. Now, that might look like dog poo to you, but in actual fact, this is I received tonight from someone, goes nameless. There's a hop plant. That's a variety that we haven't got at the brewery that I'll go and plant tomorrow, that we'll put in a trial plot that we have. We'll grow that up for this season. There's 2 of those in there. We'll grow it up this season. We'll see how it goes. We'll see whether it's worthwhile putting into our field. I think it will be. But yeah, I mean, beer is an agricultural product, and it's taking it from the ground all the way through to where we're enjoying it now, and that's something that can't be lost upon all of these beers.
Yeah. You also seem very willing to experiment as well. You have a lot of spontaneous ferment beers and interesting fruited sours and things. Do you want to comment on how spontaneous fermentation works?
Yep. So I touched on it earlier. So around us at the moment, there's a plethora of bacteria or yeasts that are floating around that are some are conducive to brewing with, a majority aren't. Given a look at the room, I'd say majority. Yeah. But so if in any of these tanks over here behind you, pretty much most of the time as brewers we're pitching a known variety of yeast, which is going to give us a known flavour component, aroma component, and arguably the ABV on the beer, which is brilliant. It's one of the best things about the brewing industry that we're able to do this. But at the same time, we're producing some beers that are traditionally brewed in Belgium and France, which are known as lambic beers. We don't utilise the term lambic; they are lambic-inspired beers for us. But we're obviously not producing them in Belgium or France, so we don't utilise the word lambic. We're terming them as spontaneous. So by that, we brew a beer pretty much as per normal. But instead of running it straight to a fermenter and pitching a known yeast onto it, whether it be a US, an English, a Norwegian yeast onto it, we're actually putting it into a large shallow vessel, and we're hot, so we're not chilling it, so we're running it straight through the brew system, running into what's known as a cool ship, and we're actually sitting it out overnight. And what occurs is everything that's around us, or for us on the farm, lands on that beer, and then the next morning, the moment that ticks below about 27 degrees, we're then transferring that into some of these oak barrels, and we're leaving it for upwards of 3 years for those yeast bacteria to assert themselves on the beer. And what we find is we get a complexity in the beer and a flavour that is very difficult to achieve from a cultured or a pitchable yeast. So it's you asked the question about science or art. It's very much a labour of love, and I think if you ask brewers what they enjoy about these styles of beers, it's that they entertain a sense of time and place. So we can go and produce a beer tomorrow night at the brewery, and we can go and produce exactly the same beer Friday night, and we leave them for the same amount of time in oak barrel, and they may, even though there's only a 24-hour difference between them, they may exert completely different flavour and aroma profiles and mouthfeel. So they are very much a descriptor of a time and place. For that reason, we're looking at weather profiles, fronts, temperatures, times, rainfall, almost taking it to an agricultural point of view on when we're producing these beers so that we can try and maximise and utilise the climatic conditions that are presented to us.
So when you're putting your beer out into the open air, into the elements, do you ever get any unwanted products? Does it ever go bad in any way, or is it sort of controlled enough that you sort of end up with something favourable?
Time is our biggest ally in that. So can you correct me here with the time frames? There's essentially the way that the fermentation works I know you won't correct me. We're essentially getting through... essentially, the way that it works, we're probably not using spontaneous beer that is under 18 months of age. That's largely because the first 9 months...
Finish your sentence.
In my understanding, the first 9 months of the fermentation within the oak barrel, it goes through quite a savoury component, and I actually use the term, it tastes like unheated Rosella tomato soup. So it goes through this really quite savoury component. It's actually quite discerning to think that at some stage down the track there's going to be something of substance to this. At around the 9 to 10 month mark, it changes, and that's...
Yeah, I think that tomato soup flavour is bang on. Like, that descriptor is exactly what you get out of it. And I think that that's a lot of that is a compound called DMS, dimethyl sulfide, which...
this is where the science comes in, and I backtrack.
That and other sort of off flavours can come early on in spontaneous from some of the less friendly microbes that land in it, and sort of they go into a frenzy while it's still quite warm, but by probably even a week into fermentation, alcohol producing brewer's yeast has taken over.
We normally see within within a barrel, if we haven't seen the ferment active within 24 hours, we're worrying. But we would normally see out of the barrel bung and stuff foam occurring. So fermentation is rapid. Yeah, and I think they have done some studies in Belgium where they do a lot of this stuff, and there's like a progression. It's quite a elegant sort of progression of simple bacteria that have a party for about a week, and then there's yeast fermentation, which produces alcohol, which sort of protects it from those enteric bacteria, which some of which are pathogens. They get killed off more or less, but some of the flavours that they produced carry on, and then they get remetabolised later on in the process when you get more slow-acting yeasts like Brettanomyces and the bacteria. And it's sort of this progression from one group of microbes to the next. So we're sort of working, as I said, we're working on a sort of 18-month-old beer, at least to begin with, so that all that process has occurred. We work on around about a 20 to 25% wastage rate. That's what we work upon. Our actual wastage rate is around 11%. So I think that's something that we're blessed with, the barrels that we work with here in Tassie. So we're working with all our spontaneous beer is pretty much exclusively Tasmanian Chardonnay barrels. So the wine industry is pretty strong here, so we give them credit. A little tip of the hat.
So our next beer is coming out, but we might ask some more general kind of questions that are feeding in through Facebook. So I've got one question here from Jeff Devine, who I think actually might be in the audience, so he might have snuck it in through Facebook because he didn't want to do it in person. But he said, as a brewer with your own unique spins on making beer, are there such things as taste trends? If so, what is popular at the moment? And do you try to cater to these trends, or do you go rogue and produce whatever you want?
Go rogue. Was that a question to Will?
That's a question to everyone.
I'm the most untrendiest brewer you'll find. I do not cater to trends. Seltzer, yeah, we've got one coming up next week.
I think that's an interesting question, especially after Will's talk, because Will's so focused kind of specifically on the farm to glass kind of aspect of beer, which is definitely not trendy, if you want to talk that. Like, it's not a double dry hop oat cream IPA or whatever you want to call the next biggest. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but whatever the next biggest trend is. But I think, well, the breweries that we're representing at the moment is we've all got very certain kind of ethoses and ways to make beer, and like beers that hopefully when you drink a Van Dieman beer or an OCHO beer or a Hobart Brewing Co. beer, you kind of know that that's their beer and the essence of their beer is there. Like, and I think that's something that's really nice about the Tasmanian brewing scene is that no one's really jumped aboard the hype train, which kind of really good. Yeah, well, excluding a few, but
Well, I think that's.
but most, yeah.
Well, we might as well move on to the next beer. Matt, do you want to introduce? So our next beer is the Hobart Brewing Co. Tascadian Dark Ale. So it's the darkest one we're drinking tonight, and the last one, sadly. But we've got Alex from Hobart Brewing Co. and he's going to tell us about the beer and why it was chosen tonight.
Thanks everyone for coming and everyone on the live stream, obviously, after I've just put my foot in it a little bit. But there's a very marked difference, I think, you can see in the glass as opposed to all the other beers that we've drunk tonight. And it's kind of already been touched on ever so slightly, but I'm going to use one of Matt's term, one of our moderators tonight, the oft forgotten backbone of the beer is the grain, or the cereal crop that gives us the sugar for the yeast to ferment, which is one of the biggest differences, I guess, between beer and other fermented beverages like wine and cider. They already have a product that has sugar in it, whereas we're working with a product that is carbohydrate rich, so starch rich. So the big difference is we have to turn a starchy product into sugar. And that's something that no one really thinks about, but if you didn't do that, there wouldn't be any alcohol. And what's really the point of drinking beer?
So starches are long chains of single sugars. So the plants, these little grains, have inside of them complex chains of sugars that are all linked together, and they're quite hard to break down, but these plants have mechanisms to break them down from the little embryo inside the seed. When it starts to germinate, it'll produce these enzymes. You want to explain?
Yeah, so Kelsey and I were talking about this earlier this afternoon. One of the really magic things about barley, which is probably, correct me if I'm wrong, but I reckon at least 95% of the beer made in the world. 87. Is it actually? Is it actually? Okay, all right. 87% of the world.
Take price out of it.
Oh, of course. Yeah, sorry. So 87% of the beer made in the world uses malted barley as a base to get the sugar. And the other parts would be rice and maybe sorghum and millet, maybe. Corn. Yeah, and corn, obviously. But that also brings it back to why barley? Why do we use barley? And I was doing a bit of research last night and I was speaking to these guys earlier this evening. And why barley? Barley's a pretty incredible crop. One, it's pretty much a self-contained brewer's dream. So it's got really high carbohydrate to protein ratio. So that means there's lots of available starches to convert to sugar. It's got its own enzymes to convert those starches into sugar, and it's got a husk around it. So you can separate those sugars from the starch and from the protein and carbohydrate-rich material around that. And I didn't really ever think about that, because when you think about corn, rice, wheat, they're all really protein-rich, don't have husks. Well, they do, kind of, but not utilised well in the brewing system. And that really just kind of spun me out, and I was like, oh, that's pretty sick. Barley's pretty awesome. Anyway, so that leads me into the colour of this beer. And so we're talking about sugars, and we're talking about how we get sugar from barley, and why is this beer black? So there are two different kinds of two different avenues of grain we can talk about. We can talk about base malts, which are the barley that provides predominant source of sugar for a beer. And then we talk about the specialty malts. So the specialty malts will be cooked a little bit more or treated ever so slightly differently to give either colour or flavour to a beer. So with a beer like this, Tascadian, it's 85% brewer's base malt to give the sugar for the alcohol, for the yeast to ferment, and then it's about 15% specialty malts. And so they're a mix of highly kilned malts. So as Will was talking about before, how he kilns his malt in his shed at the farm, which is a great setup, by the way. It's wonderfully rudimentary. Ghetto. Yeah, ghetto maybe. Ghetto. But I don't think you do any specialty malts there, do you? All just base malts. So Will's focused on turning his agricultural barley crop into a source of sugar, essentially. And he might use specialty grains that he gets elsewhere, essentially. Maybe not, definitely not, I mean, all farm to table.
Not yet.
Where he wouldn't be able to do that to get a beer like this. So we need to... I mean the colour. I mean the colour, not the quality. No. So we add certain crystal malts and black malt, which only I think about 3 to 4% black malt, which is a really highly roasted malt, to give this colour, which is crazy to think about, that such a small percentage of the total proportion of grain will give a colour like this. And this is the point where I'm going to throw it out to any question about anything, because we can all talk about science. And
I've got a question for you, Alex.
Please, Stu.
Is this a black IPA?
This is something else we were talking about before. And Stu asked, will this trigger you if I call this a black IPA? So the Tascadian, Scott, who is our head brewer here, told a great story. And I'm not going to tell it well, so I'm not going to try and tell it. But he was talking about the origins of the style. So this is a Cascadian dark ale, which is essentially a hoppy porter. So it's got the really nice roasty, sweet elements of a porter, but with the hop of an IPA. Whereas Stu's talking about a black IPA, which might not have the roast and sweetness that a porter would, but it's going to have the hop character. And sometimes, instead of using darker malts to get the colour, they'll use a thing called cinema, which is actually a beetle. It's do you know what the beetle's called?
This is a scandal. I didn't know this.
Scandalous.
I thought it was made from malt.
It's no longer vegan.
No. Well, this is vegan. Don't worry. There's no cinema in this. But cinema is I guess it's a colouring agent quite commonly used in food. But it's literally a crushed up beetle, and it gives a really intense black colour. And sometimes people will put that in a otherwise standard IPA. So if you think about Cornell's American IPA before, maybe you could add some cinema to that, turn it black with the hop colour, and that would be a black IPA.
Look out for the Shambles Black IPA.
Sorry, Matt. Just so you roast the malts for longer, and it's caramelising the sugars, so you don't necessarily need those ones for the fermentation because you've got your base malts. So you're caramelising the rest of the sugars, and that's what's giving the dark colour because they're all caramelised and a little bit burnt.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so another wonderful chemical reaction, the Maillard reaction, which is all around us all the time. Like someone's cooking a steak, you're converting amino acids and proteins into sugars and other things that are carbon, yeah, essentially. Lots of other people I'm sure will know exactly the chemical reaction, but essentially turning amino acids and proteins into sugars. And we're using a specialty malt that's that process has already happened. So we're adding unfermentable sugars into the beer, but they're giving the colour as well, yeah.
This is the third release of this beer?
Third, fourth?
Fourth? Fifth?
Fourth. It's third in the can. Is it? Second in the can. I'm looking at Jimmy, one of our other brewers out in the audience.
How many fingers is he
And
holding up?
he's currently drinking a Tascadian, helping out. I think 2 in can, 3 total. Yeah, so three batches. Yeah.
How has it changed since the original? Has it?
I think it has ever so slightly.
Is that because of ingredients available or because of drift yourselves?
I think probably more process based. I don't think the grist has changed, which is the makeup of the malt, so the proportions of malt or specialty grains in the beer. I don't think that's changed. Maybe just slightly different dry hopping and hopping in the kettle as well. Ever so slightly. It's just it's like when Kelsey was saying before about art versus science. Terrible band, but I
think we have a question here. Question? So the question is, after the beer's brewed, is there a science in the way you have to pour the beer, and should you be using particular glasses for certain beers?
Short answer is yes. Yeah. Always pour your beer into a glass. You'll appreciate it and enjoy it more. Why? The question is why. I'm up here as a brewer and a farmer, not a scientist, Stu. Because you can't see the colour of the beer in a can or a bottle.
Yeah,
and you won't enjoy the flavour or the aroma as much as if you pour it into a glass.
guess people are inherently visual people as well. Like
You drink with your eyes first.
absolutely, and it's the whole olfactory sensation through, like, you're opening up. If you're drinking from a tiny opening in a can as opposed to a large opening in the top of a glass, like really opening up that olfactory senses, so smell and the taste at the same time, and looking at it and just thinking, shit, that looks like a shit hot beer. I'm gonna love this. I think, no, but seriously, it sounds silly, but
if we're all here now, why have we all poured our beer, or majority of us poured our beer into a glass to enjoy rather than enjoying it from the vessel that it was contained within?
And especially in the world of cans, where you don't see the colour at all. Like, this could be just look like mud. And would that look as appetising in a glass? Potentially not. Anyway, we
So
don't
you know when to pour it down the sink, is that what you're saying?
Yes.
We've got a lot of very general questions from Facebook. So I might just ask a few of them. We've got one from Hamish Fletcher, which is, I love craft beer, but is guaranteed to have me worshipping the porcelain god all Sunday. I can drink an equivalent volume of commercial beer and generally be okay. Are there particular chemicals known to contribute to hangovers? If so, can you please remove them?
I've heard. I mean, that's unfortunately for you, Hamish. That's an anecdote and not data. But I can point to several other people who've said exactly the opposite, that they can drink a lot of craft beer, but if they drink an equivalent amount of commercial beer, they're written off. Is it the preservatives, yada yada?
You're an oddity, mate.
Well,
potentially maybe that the alcohol content potentially increases with a craft beer.
yeah.
And maybe there's just not really tracking that. Maybe they actually had 5.6% as
From a
opposed
science
to...
point of view, I think most of the craft or independent beers on the market don't go through. They're not adding in preservatives or additives into the beer in order to extend their shelf life, nor are they going through pasteurisation. So for most of the beers, the smaller beers on the market, flavour is the biggest component. So anything that we're adding preservatives or additives to, or going through pasteurisation, strips the flavour from that. So it's something that we're actively not trying to do. So for that reason, they're actually better for you with regards to a hangover sense, in that they don't have those preservatives or additives in them. So
it might be a healthy hangover.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a good purge.
We have another question from Jason Williams, which is there a scientific definition of what a beer is or not?
There's sort of the legal, the boring legal.
Sorry, does anyone here work for the Australian Tax Office, or anyone on the live stream? Oh, you are? Oh, okay. I'll shut up.
We don't. It's got to be above 0.5% alcohol to be considered alcoholic, and then it's actually excise is free up until 1.15% alcohol.
You wait for that trend to hit off.
Yeah,
It's already happening.
and it has to be. There is a legal definition. It's got to be made from malted grains, and it's got to have a certain level of. I think it's 4 IBUs.
Yeah, I think it's 4
of hops. Yeah. But I actually thought up until last week or the week before, when Justin corrected me by looking it up, that you don't actually have to use hops. You can use an equivalent herbal bittering agent to achieve the bitterness. So I always thought that you had to use hops for it to be defined as beer, but you actually don't.
Well, was it Cornell that was saying that the hops weren't always added to beer? It used to be stuff like juniper, but hops were originally added as an antimicrobial agent to stop the beer spoiling, right?
So I don't think it was until the 1600s, 1700s where hops became a commercial product and even commonly used in beer. So probably not a commercial product, but commonly used in beer. Before that, things like gruit and lots of other, I guess...
Herbs and spices.
Yeah, exactly. So herbs and spices were added to beer. And something that really spun me out was that hops actually came from Central Asia. Like, I always thought that hops would have had to come from Europe because they were the first instances of being used in brewing. And so, no, they came from Central Asia and weren't used there, and they travelled across the Silk Road to Europe to be used.
And the main reason they were added to beer was to be used as a natural preservative, not for the aromatic or bittering qualities, that they were deemed as a preservative nature or garnering preservative nature into the beers that they were added to.
Mark Duffett had a question that's probably more directed at Cornell, who's now left us, but you guys might be able to answer as well. And it's about why hops are why are hops so abundant that we think nothing of using 5 times as much as traditionally? So have we got better at growing them? As a home brewer, I know that it's often hops are not very available. So.
I'll answer that question by, can I get a hands up? Who loves hops in beer? Yeah. I rest my case, Your Honour.
Yeah, I think.
I guess. Sorry. You go.
No. Well, as Stu was kind of alluding to when Cornell was talking about hops, how he was saying that he added lots of hops, and this is a reason why hops are grown and stuff. And it is. It's a commercial agricultural crop, and it's a super valuable commercial crop. Like, we're sitting 50 kilometres away from one of the most sought after hop farms in the world. Like, we send containers and containers of hops to the States every single harvest. Like, more than you can imagine. Like, tons and tons of hops for millions and millions of dollars. And as long as everyone here wants to buy a hoppy beer, like, we're going to be able to grow and buy really expensive hops and use them as much as we want, I guess.
One of the biggest things in beer is most people are able to perceive bitterness in beer, and it's arguably one of the things that people say when they don't like beer. It's not that they don't like the beer, it's that they don't like the bitterness level in the beer, and that's obviously contributed to the hops that are added into it. Conversely, the large reason why IPAs, double IPAs, triple IPAs, hazies have come onto the scene in the last 10, 15 years, 20 years in the States, is largely based on the back of hops. Because of that flavour, most people can garner a fresh green, hoppy, tropical, pineapple, citrus, grapefruit, whatever it is, out of hops, and that's what they enjoy. So if you're able to provide that sort of character to a beverage, of course it's going to be popular, and that's where the subsequent flow-on effect of whether it be a variety from whatever farm, from the US, from South Africa, from Australia, whatever it is, variety-wise, that's where it's going to come into from a consumer point of view. So it's largely consumer-driven.
Mm-hmm. We've got a question in the audience.
The main... Should we repeat?
Well, you can. Okay, sorry. The question is, what kind of hops are grown in Tasmania, and what are the hops we should be looking out for that are being exported to the rest of the world?
The big one grown in Bushy Park is called Galaxy, and it sort of came onto the scene, I don't know, 5 or 10 years ago. Yeah, not that long ago, and it really took off, particularly in like the. If you think the craft brewing scene has sort of exploded in Tassie in the last 5 years, in America it's 100 times as big, and the demand for new and exciting tasting hops is enormous. So the market there, the demand for good and interesting and new hops is huge, and Galaxy came in at just the right time, and it's a generally really interesting hop. It's very sort of passion fruity, tropical, and I don't know, they grow 500 tonnes a year in Bushy Park, and I reckon most of it, well, yeah, obviously we can't use all that here in Tassie or even in Australia, but they've got, there's huge demand for it over there. So Galaxy is one of the main ones.
They also grow Cascade, Enigma, Vic Secret, Ella? Not Vic Secret, no, that's in Victoria. Vic, it's in the name, yeah. Ella, Topaz, bit of Pride or something. Pride of Ringwood.
Yeah,
no one uses that anymore. No.
There was a the Bushy Park Hop Products Australia pretty much ripped out 90% of their Pride of Ringwood or Super Pride, which were the older varieties developed in Australia in the 60s, and they're still the hops that were predominant in most commercial beers, and they're high yielding. They've got high-ish. Back in the day, they had very high relative to other hop varieties alpha acid percentage, so they were a valuable crop. But yeah, Bushy Park a few years ago saw the demand for hops like Galaxy, and pretty much they pivoted from growing mostly that variety at Bushy Park to ripping it all out and planting rhizomes like this.
Milky Way
of Galaxy and others.
The transition process for a hop farm such as Bushy Park, 50k from us, is pretty significant. So from to generate something like a Galaxy, it comes from a breeding program of about 30,000 cultivars. So, and it's taken the best part of 11 years to get it to commercial value. So, this is why hops are incredibly valuable and incredibly expensive for us as brewers to use, because the amount of IP that's involved to generate these varieties is just through the roof. So, from a cultivar such as Galaxy, that's come from 30,000 different selected cultivars across 11 years. So essentially the way that it works, the first 3 years, that 30,000 cultivars is broken down to around 2,000. That 2,000 is then broken down to a commercial growing quantity, which is around about 100. That occurs over the course of about 3 years, that it's then trial planted. Those trial plants are then determined whether or not they actually yield something of commercial value. They're then put out into a trial garden. So that occurs over the next 3 years. Though the flowers that are then harvested from that are then analysed to deem whether or not they're of commercially fit to brew with. And then from there, the farm, once they've made that decision from the 30,000 cultivars of something like Galaxy, they then make the decision to then rip up something like a Super Pride or a Pride of Ringwood and turn half the farm, if not more at the moment, at that time to bank on that variety being the big thing that's going to happen. And they turn that farm over and they grow it and they grow it and they grow it, and it occurs. So they work on about 11 years. They're working essentially 11 years in advance of beer trends. So what you're enjoying now, HPR up the road are working 11 years in advance on what you're actually going to try. And that's the same in the States. It's the same in Germany. Yeah, pretty incredible.
I mean, you've just described a huge amount of science that goes into just one ingredient, which just goes to show how much science is in beer in general. Super interesting. I have a question from the audience that was sent in before the event from Doug Richardson. Recently, Moo Brew released an IPA with a supposed alcohol content of 6.66%. How do brewers predict and plan the alcohol content of beer? And what is the margin of error around alcohol percentage listed and what may actually be in the can?
It's all a dirty lie.
Keeping in mind that we have maybe 3 minutes.
I'll say that brewers have a 0.3% buffer.
Wow.
So
That seems really accurate. 0.3. So
then 0.3.
Okay, 0.3.
So it could be 6.3. It could be 6.9.
Okay.
Sorry, 6.36 and 6.96. Which is,
Right, and how do
but
you...
it's almost certainly 6.66.
So essentially, the alcohol is derived from the amount of grain that we put into it. So you have a known sugar level in the grain, and then what you derived out of that, you get from the brew, the sugar that comes out of that, and then subsequently the yeast is able to consume that sugar to produce the known quantity of alcohol.
So it's a very known or calculated equation that you know what you're putting in, you should be able to get a known amount out.
Unless you're producing your own grain.
Okay.
Malt.
And unless you print the labels first.
Okay, we've got one last question from the audience.
Delicious.
That's a really good question. I guess they're always analysing they do a lot of sensory analysis of beer and like consumer trends and for the past half a dozen years, the most sought after flavour in beer is always that like citrus, passion fruit, tropical flavour. So for the past couple of years, I reckon most of their R&D is going to be pushing towards like getting hops that taste like orange juice, like taste like passion fruit, like lemon pith, like delicious citrus forward, fruit forward flavours, which is kind of what is getting pushed out at the moment. As Stu alluded to before about Galaxy, that's a really wonderful hop. But if they can make the next Galaxy and have every brewer in the world wanting to buy that as well as Galaxy, that's a pretty good business model.
The short answer is no, we don't know. We canvass them, and we have, and all of the brewers in the room, we have really good relationships with the HPA guys and stuff, and it's certainly through no fault of our own in trying to ascertain what's occurring. But yeah, again, largely it's driven by you guys in the room. It's what you guys are going to buy is going to dictate what's going to occur. And hopefully that's Tasmanian beer.
We might have to ask the last question, which we're going to take from Facebook, which is from Paul, and it's, how do you get an OCHO t-shirt?
Stay tuned. Announcement tomorrow.
All right, well, I think that's all the time we have for. So thank you to all the brewers for contributing these amazing beers. And thank you to everyone who sent in a question. We have so many more questions, but we're going to try and answer them somehow and post them on Facebook or something. We'll send you the questions to get some answers. Thank you to everyone who's watching at home. It's amazing that we can have sort of like 2 events happening at once. I mean, through COVID times, the event, we sort of had to be able to do both and have the at-home version as a backup, but it's awesome that people are willing to be at home anyway, so it's great. Shout out to people who are watching on the mainland as well. So the spread is even wider than just Tassie, which is so great. Thank you to JRS Videography for doing the live stream. Thanks again to Hop, Vine and Still for the distribution. That's made our life a lot easier. And if you've enjoyed this event, we encourage you to follow us on Facebook. We're called Science Made Beerable. We are endeavouring to keep posting blogs and interesting science things that are happening in Tasmania and around the world. Also follow all of these guys on social media. Their breweries are always posting really interesting stuff. Will, for example, is constantly posting amazing stories on Instagram. It's very science communication vibe. Like, you will learn a lot about how beer is made if you watch that. He also has a really cute dog called Barley, so you should follow him. But thanks again. We hope to do this again next year, bigger and better, so stay tuned.
Thank you. Thank you very much to Kelsey and Matt.